Today we're talking about legibility and why it matters. So in some cases, when a letter doesn't look like itself, it can be just really confusing to the eye and takes a little bit longer to read than it should. But in other cases, when a letter or a word doesn't look like it should, like if a letter looks like another letter, that can completely change the meaning of the word and what you're trying to convey. So I'm going to go through a bunch of examples for you today, and these are taken from inspiration of things that I've seen online, whether it's on Instagram or in Facebook groups. So before I even get started, I just wanted to put out a little disclaimer that these are simply my recommendations based on my own experiences of things that I've seen that have taken me longer to read than it should, or letters that looked like other letters that changed the meaning of the word. However, any recommendation that I make, if you don't agree with it, that is totally fine. Your style is your own. You can choose to create the letters however you want. One of my favorite things to say, though, is never sacrifice legibility for style. So don't try to make something so stylistic that you can't even read it anymore, because that's not really the point of lettering. You want to be able to create something that you're reading. But again, anything that I point out today is simply my own observation and recommendation, and if you don't agree with me, I totally support that. In fact, I'd love to hear in the comments if there are any letters or anything that I point out that you have a different opinion on, because I think that's a great way to learn and grow. Okay, so let's get started with these two letters. Now, looking at them, they are different letters, or they're supposed to be, but they look pretty similar to one another. And if you're just looking at this, you may think one of them is a B and one of them is an F, and that is correct. So this first one was in the word gift, and the second one is in the word blessed. However, I see this all the time where sometimes the lines are a little bit blurred between what an F and what a B should look like. So in order to make the F look more like an F, first of all, here's the traditional way of creating it. Connecting this bottom loop at the baseline and the top loop up here, the top of the X height, so that these two loops are a reflection of one another. So attaching this loop higher up is where it starts looking like a B. So if you are going to bring this loop higher up, then make sure that you go all the way back to the stem rather than leaving a gap and then exiting out. You can add a loop there, but if one way you can avoid confusion is by adding the loop on the left side here rather than on the right here. And then also having this piece be so horizontal like this versus coming in at an angle and leaving at an angle, this will help it look more like an F. And then the other thing is, if you look at the loop sizes, so if anything, this size of this loop right here is bigger than the top loop. So to avoid that, if you make the top loop bigger and the bottom loop a little bit smaller, that's also really going to help it look more like an F. So bigger on the top, smaller on the bottom if you do want them to be two different sizes, rather than doing the opposite, because that's where it starts looking like a B. Okay, to make the B look not like an F, first of all, the traditional way of creating this B is coming up like this. So this piece comes straight up along the slant line, not curving inward like that. And then creating this piece right here that comes down and back up. So down and up. So it's like an underturn here. So keeping this piece along this axis rather than bringing this in is going to help it stay looking like a B. You can also experiment with different variations of the B by making it this way so that you're not having this loop on the bottom. Then the other thing is, you can see that this is coming down below the baseline. The loop is coming below it. So even though this is trying to be a little bit of a bouncy style, I can see some S and D coming below the baseline, I would just keep this entire B resting on the baseline just to completely avoid the confusion there. Okay, same thing with the F. Like the higher up you make it and the closer you make the bottom of it to the baseline, the more it will look like a B. So keeping this part, the loop, down below the baseline will help. So I saw this one out in the wild on Facebook, and it was within a word. And at first, when I show you what the actual word is, you'll see why I was confused. To me, this looks like a D at first, like a lowercase d. But it is missing the shading right here. So this is actually an L, and it was in the word love. However, since it does look so much like a D, this could definitely look like it says dove or dove. So this L looks a lot like a D, and a couple reasons for that. Number one, obviously this loop is pretty big, but it's also pretty rounded. So instead of having such a rounded or oval loop right here, the loop can be a lot smaller. Also, the axis of the loop should be horizontal. So if you just look at this loop, if you make the axis horizontal rather than along this way like this one is. Actually, this axis, since it is so round, it's kind of hard to tell. You could say it's this way, but also you could say it's this way. Either way, it should be more horizontal like this. Okay, the other thing is starting this with such a straight stem is mimicking the top of the D, so you could add a curve to it starting with a slight narrow or thin stroke and then tapering down and finishing it off that way. That will help it look a lot less like a D. I think the biggest thing though is keeping that loop size small and not as round. Okay, so next we have this letter, which to me looks a lot like an H. If I bring up what the rest of the letter is, it could say hey, so H-E-Y. However, it was actually supposed to be a K, and it was supposed to say key. Actually, this was in the word whiskey. So this piece right here is what makes it a K, but that piece is so tiny and almost looks like it's part of this loop, or like it was just kind of forgotten and added on later. So in order to fix that and make this look more like a K, the number one thing is making this piece more obvious, and you can do that by adding a slight shade to the edge of it. So a shade right here. There are a couple other styles of K that you could do just to really avoid that confusion. For example, making a loop there instead of making this piece straight, or starting off the same way as this one if you wanted to have this piece kind of mimic that same compound curve of the H, like this, and then add this piece but add a little dot right there, like this. Okay, so I would probably actually draw that like this, where the K comes down with our ascending stem loop, and then starting at the bottom, come up and over, and then add that piece at the end. So either way, we're adding this dot here. Now, as long as this dot, actually this is starting to look a little bit too drooped down, I would maybe keep the dot a little bit higher up, closer to the top of the X height right here. Either way, something needs to be added to the edge of this, whether it's a dot or just some shading or an actual loop here. The other thing would be leaving some more space between where this part attaches to the stem and where this arm attaches. Like in this example, you can see that there's a little bit more space added here, or in this example, there's some more white space. So either way, making sure that like when you take a step back and look at it from far away, this can definitely look like an H. So just keep looking at your work from a different perspective, and I think that's gonna help. Okay, next we have these two letters. And when I show you the full word, you'll be able to hopefully tell what the letter is supposed to be. But from here, they both look like a lowercase e. So whether the lowercase e is starting with a leaden stroke like this, or looks like this, but these were actually supposed to be C's. So for the word cry, for example, it could start looking like E-R-Y. That's for a couple of reasons. So first of all, I mean, the leaden stroke for this C should not be crossing through right here because that just looks so much like an E. So I would keep, if you are going to do a leaden stroke that starts like this, I would simply make it like this. In fact, you could draw the C first and then add in the leaden. But as long as it's not going through here, that's where it makes it look like an E. For this one, it's just that this piece is curving inward too much. So especially if you're rushing, it could curve in so much that it actually, like, that gap starts to go away and it does look like an E. But from far away, even though we can tell that there still is a gap right here, from far away, it still looks like an E. So if you are going to bring this part down, then one thing to look at would be making sure that you're just coming down along the slant line here, so like this, rather than coming down and in. It is useful to add that shading there, because if you just made a C like this, then there's some openness in this area and it doesn't look balanced. So I do like adding that shade. You can either add it as a shade or as a dot, but either way, just make sure that there's enough white space in here and that this doesn't curl in so much that it becomes an E. Here's this one. So this looks not really like a letter to me, but it kind of looks like an N. Yeah, it doesn't really look like much. It could, and when I showed this to some other people, they said maybe it looks like a B that has an interesting stem right here. It is a Z, so like for the word zoo. So a couple things about this. First of all, when you're making a Z, I would recommend keeping the second hump of it completely below the baseline. So this entire loop is below the baseline. So if my baseline's here, none of this loop comes back up like how this one does. So if this is the baseline, this one comes back up instead of staying down below it. And then the other thing is, if you make the Z with a regular overturn like this, and then the loop, even if the loop comes up, this is the same as the start of the N. So one thing that you can look at is, instead of coming down flat like this, if you kind of taper it inwards like this, that will help. Okay, this next one looks a lot like a D out of context, but when it was in context in this word, so this is supposed to say dad with some mixing and matching of font styles or lettering styles using the capital letter, but it kind of looks like an N, like it's supposed to say Dan, rather than dad. So if you did want to mix and match and use something capital in here and make this a D, a couple of things. First of all, I would recommend that you bring this loop much closer to the stem. So see how in here we have a pretty decently sized gap between the stem and where this loop comes through. That's where it looks like an N, because an N has a gap here. So I would either bring this loop much closer so that there's no gap, or you could come back through like this and close it off, or it doesn't even have to have a loop if you just wanted to come in like this, okay? The other thing too is that just like the spacing and sizing of this looked a little weird to me, how like this lowercase d comes up taller than where the capital one is supposed to be. So so this is a kind of trend right now of mixing and matching lowercase and capitals. I would just be really sure that what you're writing is clear and that it looks like what you are hoping it should say, just so that it doesn't start looking like other letters. Okay, this was the beginning of a word, and I showed this to some people and there was a lot of mixed reviews of like what this looks like. So some people thought it looked like a capital A with an R and then the next letter. Some people thought it looked like a capital C with maybe a U and another letter. It actually says loop, so it's L-O-O-P. When I looked at it, the only thing that really bothered me were the O's, but I can definitely see how the L mixed in would look like an A-R, And by AR, it would be like this kind of A that just has a lead-in like this. Okay, but the biggest thing is that the O's, and they kind of look like V's to me, like a V that looks like this, but maybe starting off like this. And so the reason for this is there's this gap here, and then secondly, it's the way that this O starts. So whereas the goal was to make it look like this, like an O, it ended up looking like this. So you can see starting this part of it off with flat on the top doesn't make it look very rounded like an O. So you could start it by tapering, keeping it narrow at the beginning and getting thicker and then back thin. And then I would also suggest wrapping this top piece around so that it crosses through that piece. But if you really wanted to keep a slightly open gap, you could do something that looks more like this. I personally wouldn't do it like this because I think it's easy to make it look not like an O. But if you did want to keep this loop more on the right rather than wrapping all the way around, I would just be very cautious not to leave much of a gap here, and then also starting it thin rather than with a flat top. What does this look like? So to me it looked like an N, like a bouncy N. So it was supposed to be in this word, it was supposed to be an H, shut. But when I asked some people about it, they also thought it looked like it said snut. So the big thing here is making sure that the H, so even though the traditional way of making the H is with a loop like this, it is fine, totally fine. I do this a lot actually, to make the stem just a straight stick rather than having a loop on it. But if you are going to do that, I would, number one, make it tall enough that like the shorter you make it in relation to the compound curve here, the more and more it looks like an N. So keeping it tall, I like to keep mine twice as tall as the letter, or twice as tall as the X height. So if my X height is here, then my stem would go all the way 2 times as tall. The other thing would be, see how this one, the exit of the S is connecting at the top of the H, like that. I would not do that. I would connect it halfway up like this, because connecting it at the top just makes it look not like an H and looks a lot like an N here. Okay, so keeping this taller and not connecting at the top is going to help a lot. So to me, this looks like an I and an S that maybe they just forgot to dot the I. It was actually in the word U, so this was a Y. And the reason that it looks like this is because they were running out of room, so it was like they were at the bottom of the page and there wasn't enough room to make a descending stem loop for the Y, so they had to like bring it out like this. And I can see why they did that, obviously, because they were running out of room. But instead of doing that, I would have probably just brought the Y up higher, like this, so that there was room for this. So a couple ways to make sure that your Y looks like a Y is keeping the majority of the loop under this piece of it. So you can see right here that none of the loop of the Y is below this underturn, whereas in a regular Y, if you were doing it with the underturn on top, then the loop would come down below it like this. So it's kind of all in line here, whereas none of the loop is below the Y. Also, this big gap right here, I would try to eliminate that. So after creating this piece of it, rather than going out to the right, you can come out a little bit, but if you feel like your Y doesn't look like a Y, then coming down along your slant line, or if you're not using paper with slants, coming down parallel to this piece, like this, that will help. Okay, I have some more examples, so hopefully you're enjoying this. So this, to me, looks like a lowercase u. When I show you the whole word, it still is kind of unclear. So this actually says shower, like baby shower, but because this W doesn't really have a clear end and it just goes directly into the E, it starts looking like a U instead of a W. So be really clear with if the traditional way of doing it would be to create an exit piece like this. But if you didn't want to have that shade there, you could finish it off maybe like that and then start your E, or you could create an open loop here that goes into the E, or just add some more space between the W and the E just so that it doesn't look like a U. And then the other thing is this O is similar to what we were talking about earlier, where it doesn't exactly look like an O. And if this piece right here came down farther, then this section might look like an R. So here, to me, this looks like a capital D. There's a couple different ways you can do the capital D, but if I pull up the rest of the word, it was supposed to say berry. It looks like dairy, D-E-R-R-Y. So instead of having a lowercase b, it looks like a D. So a couple ways to fix this. I think the most obvious would just be keeping this stem taller in relation to the rest of the lowercase letters at the X height, but also taller than this loop right here. So I guess if you wanted to start at the same stem size, then I would make this loop smaller. But I think for consistency and clarity, I would make this loop higher up. You can also add a loop on that stem just to emphasize the fact that it's a B and not a D, because a D wouldn't have that loop there. So this one looks like it could be CL, would not have a loop, it would just be a stem. It was actually supposed to be a capital A for the word always, but because there was so much of a gap here, it's kind of hard to tell. Now, for lots of these, as you're probably seeing, your brain can figure out what the word is. Like, looking at this in context, it does look like always. But I just want you to be careful if, for example, for this A, this is what it looks like here, but the problem is the gap here. So when you're making this A, I would suggest keeping this part, if you do want to leave a gap open here, that you cover the top of this rather than leaving any gap in the top right here. Come over this, or the other way to avoid that would be by simply connecting them like this. So just be careful with gaps, because gaps make things look like two separate pieces, and so that's where this looks like a C and an L. Close up your gaps or figure out some way to make sure that they don't look like two separate pieces. So to me, this looks like it could be a capital J and an L. This could look like maybe a capital I even, if it were higher up. But this was supposed to say home, so this was supposed to be an H. So I think the biggest thing here is keeping the size of these two pieces a little bit closer in size to one another. This one is basically 2 times as tall as this one. Like, you could fit this one twice here. So keeping them closer to being the same height, so that would look more like this, where this loop down here is smaller, or the other way to fix it would be bringing this part down farther so that they're similar size, more similar in size. The other thing that I fixed there was the main shade of this piece starts about where this second piece does, whereas in this one you can see that this is kind of not fully shaded until down here, and that's lower than the top of that one. The other thing would just be going back to the gaps. If you aren't connecting these, then they could look like two separate pieces. Alrighty, now this was an interesting one, because hopefully to you it also looks like an I and a T, where the crossbar of the T is covering the I. However, I taco is not a word. So it can't be an I. So it looks like this was supposed to be the entrance stroke of the T. And I did notice some other stylizing going on in the word and in the sentence that this person was writing as a whole, where the ends of their thin strokes had this thickness, and that's totally fine to do. I actually really like that style. I would just be really cautious of entry elements like this looking like an I. So a couple ways that could be fixed is simply starting this lower, so this leaden could look more like this. You could also start it a little bit farther away, like that. Or keep the direction of this a little bit different maybe, so like that. So I know that might be a little bit awkward to write, but I think it's just being really clear that this piece is not an I, and the reason it looks like an I is because of the height of it, and like so where it starts, and then also the fact that it's as close to the T as the other letters, so like the distance here and here. So those are just some things to play around with, the height and the distance of where it starts. The other thing you could do too is just make it less thick, so not as thick as your other downstrokes. So if your other downstrokes are this thick, you could, well, I would seriously consider making this shorter, but I guess if you didn't want to make it shorter, you could just make the shade less obvious so that it doesn't look like a letter. This one isn't like the worst one that I've seen, but it could be construed as maybe an H that has a loop right here, which would be a little bit not normal. So it is supposed to be a capital L, and looking at it in the word, it's pretty obvious that it says love, but just some things that I would fix about this L are, instead of making this piece come down and back up, that's where it looks like the compound curve of the H. If you make it more horizontal, so like this, so a couple things happen there. First of all, that loop becomes closer to that horizontal loop that we talked about earlier, rather than being this direction. Okay, do you see the difference there? Being more horizontal rather than coming up like this. But then also, this piece doesn't look as much like a compound curve. So if I draw that over here, using the same leaden stroke that they used, but then coming down like this, that looks much more like an L. The other thing that is typical of the L is that this top loop is bigger in proportion than this one. So here, these loops were about the same size as one another. But I think having a bigger top loop makes it look more like an L. So another way you can draw this is by doing this piece first and then adding this on either that way or starting here and coming back around like that. All right, in isolation, this definitely looks like an N to me. And actually it looks like an N that has the same type of lead-in piece that I was talking about for there, which again, I really like that style actually. But this is supposed to be an M and say moon, but because noon is a word and this looks like an N, you could also think it says noon. So it was supposed to say moon. I think it was like I love you to the moon and back, but it looks like an N. So I would consider making these, like making it less stretched out, because it looks like if I were just to make it more dramatic, it looks like this first piece, because it's kind of stretched out, it looks like the lead-in stroke of the N, pretty similar to what it looks like right here. So by making it closer together, and then since this is more of a capital style of M, I would also make it taller, like up to here. If you were making a lowercase m, or wanted to make it look more like a lowercase m, then I would start it like this. So that's the traditional way of making the lowercase m, and then the N is like this. So in this style, this person chose to make it a little more bouncy by bringing this part up, so you could mimic that here for the M, either on that hump or this one or this one. Any of the three would work. I think the fact that there's so much space in here and here is what makes it look less like an M and more like an N. So what do you think that is? Looks a lot like a capital B to me. But it's actually an I and a Z. So this is fizz. So this is going back to the Z, where this second hump comes up really high. And I think just in general, this Z is like as tall as a capital letter. So if we were to recreate this, I think one thing that would probably help too would be an entrance stroke for the I, but say we didn't want to do that. I would keep the top of this Z less tall compared to the top of the I. So instead of coming all the way up here, if we keep it more in line with the size of the I, also making the bottom of this piece more curved rather than down and up. If we keep it more curved, then that's where this will look more like an I. And then secondly, instead of bringing this second hump of the Z back up like this, if we keep it down below, because the second part is high, the whole thing is higher, which makes it closer to the stem of this B. Whereas here, keeping it down lower, there's really no way that it would look like this was trying to attach to this stem like it does here. So that looks a lot more like fizz, in my opinion. If you did want to keep this Z shorter, like keep it all within this area, you could still do that and just make this smaller, but dotting the I and adding the entrance is going to help. All right, so then on a similar note, this is supposed to be a B, but it could look like an I and a Z. So if we bring this loop in farther here so that this piece becomes closer to the stem, and then also leave less of a gap here and here, that's where this looks more like a B. And then I would also say this amount of space here, if you can minimize that. So, I mean, if you wanted to have a little bit of space there, that is fine, but the farther away you make this, the more it will look like two separate letters rather than one letter. All right, what does this look like? Because to me, it looks like an S. But if I look at the actual word, it's supposed to be a G. So the G looks a lot like an S, and if I draw what a G should look like, or the traditional way of making the G, we can see some reasons why. So first of all, this open gap right here. And secondly, so if you did want to leave this a little bit open, instead of making this piece right here horizontal, I would bring it up more here to create at least the illusion that this is a closed off oval. In other words, it would look like this. So that's a lot more clear than having this piece go directly, smoothly down like this. So bringing this up here, that's going to help. And then also the fact that this piece and this piece are pretty similar to each other in curvature and size, I would consider making this loop a little bit narrower or less rounded as the top here. So if you see like the difference between this oval versus this descending stem loop, this is more teardrop shaped like this. So that can just help. But of course, looking at it within the word, you can tell it's a G, but isolating it, or if you had a different word, then it might not be so obvious. So that kind of leads into the next one. So what letter do you think this is? So I showed a few people. Some people thought it looked like a G. Maybe like the kind of G that we were trying to make up there. Some people think it looks like a C and a J. In some cases, it looked like an N. So if I bring up the word, can you tell what it is? To me, it still looks like gun, but it's actually supposed to be sun. So this is supposed to be an S. I don't really think it looks like an S, and I think a lot of people would agree. However, of course, if you like this style, keep going with it. But some things that you can consider doing to make it look more like an S are, first of all, keeping these two downstrokes right here are really far apart from each other this way, and also they're not like stacked on top of one another. So if I wanted to make an S like this, I would keep, so if you can see like where this downstroke here and then this downstroke here, they're stacked on top of each other, but if you look at like the top and bottom of this one compared to the top and bottom of this one, it's almost like they're next to each other. So if this one were brought down a little bit more, that would look more like an S. So bring this part down here, and then connect them this way. Also, this connecting piece, so the piece that connects this part and this part, so the piece that connects them, you can make it horizontal, you can make it curved downward. If you're going to start making it curve upward, That's fine. I just wouldn't go so far upward because that's another reason why it looks a little strange. This piece is just really long and comes up really high up. So that's where it starts looking less like an S. So those couple of things will help. I think probably one of the biggest things is this part right here that is kind of bothering me. So like this part isn't really characteristic of an S. So an S, this part usually comes down rather than up, or at least to the side. It can never hurt to take a step back and look at your word and make sure it says sun and not gun. Okay, for this one, if I put it in context, so this is the word May, like the month. This looks kind of like an H, or it just doesn't really look like an M, and I think the reason why is because this loop. So the loop is really big, which, oops, just this first part here, that looks a lot like an H to me with just like an extra little hump to it. So I would keep, if you are going to do a loop there, I would keep the loop much smaller and not as tall. So the loop width, I think, should be smaller, and then the height. So this loop itself is like taller than the X height. I would keep it maybe half the height of the X height if you really wanted to have a loop there. So maybe something more like this, and that makes it look less like an H, more like an M. What about this one? This looks like it could be a lowercase L, or maybe an E that's kind of tall. It's supposed to say Cassie, so this is supposed to be a capital C, but it looks like Lassie. And to fix this, the fact that this loop right here is so similar to the teardrop shape that's in an ascending stem loop, like for the L right here. So this shape and this shape look so similar that it doesn't really look like a C, it looks like an L. Also, I tend to prefer when the C doesn't connect to the next lowercase letter. So for example, this could finish off this way, or you could even bring it in more and then start the A like this. Separate these because this then stops looking like an L, or even bring that in farther. You can bring it all the way through. Or you could just consider using a different type of leaden stroke. So rather than coming up like this, you could, first of all, the angle that that crosses at could be a little bit differentiated so that it doesn't look so teardrop shaped like the ascending stem loop. So if it came in more like this, or flipping that part like this, and then that looks less like an L and more like a C. Okay, what about this? So to me it looks a lot like a Q, but it's actually supposed to be an L. So a Q would look something like this. Looks like a Q, not like an L. And so the bottom part is actually really good. I really like that loop here, and then the way that this finishes off. I think the biggest thing is that this stem just curves so far this way. So even without that piece, like if we took that piece away, I still think that an L that curves so much like that doesn't look as much like an L. I think having it maybe like straighter, so coming down this way, or like we talked about earlier, you could taper in from the top right here rather than coming in from that way. Okay, so these look like two lowercase j's next to each other, possibly. There's supposed to be two s's in the word blessed. A few things here. I wouldn't bring this loop down so far below the baseline. So it is fine to, if I wanted to fix this, you could make them not quite as low. Also, the fact that this downstroke is just pretty straight like this, I would probably want to curve it more to make it look more like an S. The other thing though that I would say is that this top loop, I would either make it more obviously a loop, so make it more open, especially if you want to make this bottom loop bigger. So in other words, two big loops, or what I was saying about making it obviously a loop. So I can see that there's a tiny loop in there, but you could just close it off if you didn't want to actually have a loop. on the top and then still make the bottom part pretty big. So I think that the keys are not making this loop come down so far, and keeping, instead of basically making this like a downstroke that's pretty flat right here, if you curve it more, that'll help it look more S-like. All right, so this could look like a couple different letters. It kind of looks like an S to me, but it's actually, oh, and I've heard a couple people say that it looks like an L, but it's a J, a capital J for the name Jeff. So I would consider not bringing this entry element so far down like this. I would either keep it up higher, like this, or curve it back in more. So like that. But when it just kind of goes down like this, then that's where it starts to look like the entry element for an S. Okay. Also, you can consider having the axis of this loop, instead of keeping it the same as what the axis of your S loop would be, it could be a little bit more slanted that way. Maybe like that. And then also, if you were to keep this J a little bit lower, so that more of, or I guess the loop lower, so keeping more of this loop below the baseline, then that would help too. All right, so this letter looks like it could be an H that just kind of ends. It's actually supposed to be a B. And going back to the whole leaving gaps, I think the danger of leaving gaps is that it doesn't really look like the letter. So I would either bring this in further back towards the stem, or actually loop it through like this. So this I see a lot actually, and it looks like an R that just has like a little leaden stroke there. It's supposed to be CR. Crazy. A couple reasons why it doesn't look like a C. First of all, the height of it, so here it's just shorter. Secondly, I think if it had an entrance stroke, it would be more obvious. And then the third thing is having a C that looks like this versus adding in a dot or shade there. That can really make a difference. So adding in that dot, that makes it look more like a C. So if I were to rewrite this, just making this part taller, even if you don't add shade or an entrance stroke, I think will help, because this would be a pretty big lead-in stroke for the R, but I do think having an entrance stroke for the C will help separate it, and then also adding in that shade right there. So once again, hopefully this has helped you think more about the creation of your letters and critiquing your work and taking a step back and looking at it from far away. Really make sure that all of the elements of the letter are showing up how you expect them to, and that the word reads like you would. You can also ask friends and family or social media followers for feedback. If they think that something looks like a different letter, then don't be discouraged and don't be offended. I think it's important to notice these things rather than to create a bunch of work that you can't read, because I'd rather have you fix it sooner than later. Also, like I said earlier, if any of these styles are things that you do prefer, like if you do really like the look of these two S's, then I say go for it. These are just my personal recommendations and opinions, and I don't want you to be offended if you do make a letter a certain way that I said not to, because your own lettering style is just that. It's yours. It's your own unique style. You can do whatever you want. I just hope that this gets you thinking about how other people may also perceive your work. Hi, and thanks for watching. If you like this video, hit the thumbs up button below and be sure to subscribe so that you can see more videos just like this. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.